Hello, everyone, and welcome to Whiskey Uncorked. My name is Brian, and we are back with another whiskey review this week. This is a continuation of my exploration into some lower ABV examples of single malt Scotch whiskey. And if you're interested in more of what I mean by that, you can go back and check out the podcast episode that I posted a couple weeks prior to this. But to sum things up, I'm taking a look at some lower ABV whiskeys that I mostly skipped in the beginning of my journey when most people drink them. And I'm taking the approach of trying to look at them for what they are and not so much what they aren't, meaning that my gripes and criticisms, although I'll certainly mention them, aren't going to be the main focus of this. I'm going to try to look at this from a somewhat positive standpoint, at least in terms of is this hitting the mark for maybe who it's aimed at? Not necessarily what I think of it, but obviously that opinion's going to come through one way or the other. So if you spend a lot of time watching YouTube whiskey channels and you've been drinking whiskey for any length of time and in any amount and variety, you probably don't need me to tell you whether you should go out and buy a bottle of Laphroaig 10-year-old to begin with. So this isn't necessarily for you anyways. I don't think that you're going to watch this review after drinking whiskey for 10 years and say, oh man, how have I missed out on how great Laphroaig 10 is or anything. But if you are a beginner, why don't we start with just kind of going really briefly what to expect from this bottle of Laphroaig. So Laphroaig is a single malt Scotch whiskey. It is from the very famous island of Islay, which is known for very smoky, peaty whiskeys. This is going to be a similar style to like Ardbeg and Lagavulin and Port Charlotte and a number of other distilleries, many of which that we've talked about previously on this channel. We've certainly talked about Laphroaig a lot, as the 2024 Laphroaig Carchis Special Edition was my whiskey of the year last year. So although many, but not all, Islay whiskeys are very smoky, one of the things that people tend to hone in on is kind of the signature character of the peat style. They can share similar character qualities in other ways, like it being kind of all these Islay whiskeys having a bit of a saltiness, maybe some citrus and lemon, that sort of thing. But people tend to hone in on the specific effects that the smoky peat has on the whiskey. And Laphroaig's is pretty distinct. Laphroaig is known for a medicinal smokiness. And generally speaking, what people are talking about is Band-Aids and iodine or medicine cabinet or nurse's office or something like that. Medicinal can also mean things like cherry cough drop and menthol and that sort of thing. But this is going to be more very famously Band-Aids and iodine with a campfire right next to it. Now, before I go any further, there's one big thing you need to consider if you are going to be possibly buying a bottle of this, and that is what version of Laphroaig 10 are you getting? Because there's actually three. There's the cast strength version, which can be well over 50% ABV, is significantly more expensive than your standard 10-year-old versions, and yeah, if you mistakenly buy that one, you're probably going to be in for a bit of a ride unless you're an experienced peated whiskey drinker who likes super high ABVs. But if we're talking about the standard 10-year-old, you're either going to see a 40 or 43% ABV version depending on where you live. Fortunately, here in the US and in many parts of the rest of the world, we are going to be getting this at 43% ABV, where very famously in Scotland and the UK itself, where this is made, they are getting this at a lowly 40% ABV, the bare minimum to be considered whiskey. So if you aren't sure, make sure you know which version you're getting, because that 3% difference can have a pretty significant impact, because it might also mean that there's some additional filtration going on, maybe even a little bit more caramel coloring being added, because coming in at below 46%, this is going to be chill filtered and does have caramel coloring added. And in order to make up for a more diluted version at 40%, there may be a need to add a little bit more coloring and maybe a little bit more filtration to make sure that it stays clear when drunk on ice or in a cold temperature. So if you do notice that you are being offered the 40% version, I highly recommend looking for a reviewer who has that version, because it could be significantly different. And in fact, given that most Scotch whiskey reviewers are from the UK or Scotland, at least the ones that I end up watching, I suppose, they have a little bit different opinion, because I came into this thinking like this was probably going to be not a great bottle of whiskey, and I was going to be really disappointed in it. And if I'm being fully transparent, that's not entirely true. Laphroaig characterizes themselves as right on the box, certainly, and I believe it's on the label here. Yeah, the most richly flavored of all Scotch whiskeys. It's a bold claim, but if you're getting supernatural Laphroaig, it's not really that ridiculous of a claim. Laphroaig is known for being a very bold, pungent, and very flavorful whiskey in general, which in some degree, in some senses, you can argue makes it clear why they aren't selling this at 46% and completely unchill filtered and natural color, and things like, say, Ardbeg and Lagavulin. The 8-year-old, at least. The 16 is certainly 43% chill filtered and colored. But I just reviewed the 8-year-old not too long ago, and it is actually one of my favorite Islay whiskeys at this point. So you can understand that if they do have a very bold, very strongly flavored whiskey, that maybe for their introductory brand or offering, maybe they want to kind of lessen that a little bit so people aren't completely overwhelmed. They do have the select version of Laphroaig, which is significantly cheaper than this, at least here in the U.S., and is probably it hasn't gotten good reviews from what I've seen. I have never bought a bottle because, generally speaking, from people that I watch on YouTube, it's not viewed as being a very good bottle of whiskey. So I've completely avoided that. Maybe someday, if I'm getting to that point in my journey where I'm really kind of trying to eliminate or kind of check off from just the official bottling list, the things that I haven't tried yet, and I'm trying to round out that experience overall, maybe I'll grab one. But it's not something that I'm necessarily looking forward to. But yeah, I'll give some quick personal nosing and tasting notes. But again, this is really just kind of to round out my overall experience. If you're a beginner, you are going to be confronted with a pretty strong smoky quality that's going to be pretty distinctive. Seaweed, maritime notes like, salty sea breeze, that sort of thing. But yeah, 43% is still pretty fragrant, right? This is not something that is just kind of dead in the water. Certainly having, like last week when we talked about the Macallan 12, which is also 43%, it was really subtle. This certainly is kind of coming out of the glass a little bit more, and that's largely going to be thanks to the peat and the smoke. The artificial coloring, I think, on this is pretty heavy, which, I mean, the bottle is dark green. I don't really understand what the need to color your whiskey at all. I mean, I get eventually someone's going to see it sitting in the glass, but then they're going to taste it and they can make their opinion based on how it tastes, not necessarily what it looks like. But in my opinion, this is a pretty heavily colored whiskey, particularly considering that some of the other Islay distilleries are really using casks that aren't providing much because they want to showcase their distillery quality. And on the nose, you do kind of get that artificial sweetness, flat Coke smell on the nose. But generally speaking, I would say the peat is enough to make up for that. And unless you're a really experienced drinker, that's probably not going to be apparent to you. You're going to be focused much more on that medicinal style of peat. Now, for me, the Band-Aids, they are still here, but not as much as they were maybe when I was just getting into whiskey. However, I can still pick them up very strongly if I were to leave this glass out like overnight and in the morning pick it up and smell it. That's when I'm going to get that big blast of Band-Aids that have been smoldering in the ashes of a campfire for a few hours. But generally speaking, I think it's fragrant. It's still pretty pleasant. There's a sweetness here that's maybe a little bit more orange than the kind of lemon that I get in, say, like the Ardbeg and the Lagavulin 8-year-old. There are some toffee notes. There is a little bit of a drier, darker, not sugary sweet, but a little bit more of a molasses or toffee is more accurate. But yeah, it's not quite as fresh and bright and lemony as some of those other more well-presented 10-year-olds that I normally buy are. But let's taste it and see how it goes down today. Cheers. A little thin on the palate. It's not terrible though. Getting a lot of like cigar box, Spanish cedar type smokiness on the palate on that sip. It's not completely dead. Like some of these like super heavily chill filtered versions are. I'm really worried that that 40% version would be really anemic. But this does still have a nice little pop of flavor. I've talked about in the last couple of videos about my issue with chill filtration can be texture related, but really to me it always feels like when that flavor is supposed to get kind of really loud and tell you the most information about what the whiskey is, it's kind of decapitated at the top. It never quite hits that peak. It kind of falls off too quickly. And that is certainly the case here. But again, I can see if you're trying to make your whiskey accessible to a wide range of people, and this is one thing I didn't get into, Laphroaig 10 is available everywhere. It's a supermarket whiskey here in the US, and there aren't many single malts that are commonly found in supermarkets in the US. They're pretty limited to your very, very famous brands, and Laphroaig does tend to be the super heavily peated option, at least by me or in my experience. It's typically the bottle that I'm going to see. Another sip here. Yeah, I'm getting a little bit of that kind of Band-Aid peat, a little less woody, that sip, but it does still have a pretty nice little punch of flavor. And I think that's kind of where I've fallen with this bottle. And again, this is the 43% version. So if you're the 40, I can definitely see, as I just said, the 40% version just being too characterless. Just feeling completely neutered. Normally I wouldn't nitpick over 3% ABV, but I think it's going to require some additional filtration and that sort of thing to keep it clear, and maybe even a little bit of extra coloring, which can, to me, oftentimes affect the texture when it's too diluted. And if you're adding too much, it almost replaces the natural texture, and it gives it like this really artificial, like silky thing that it'll have, similar to like in a cocktail if you add too much simple syrup, not necessarily in the sweetness, but it'll just have this kind of, not quite slimy, but like I said, silky isn't too nice of a word and slimy's too rude, but it just doesn't feel natural when you, as opposed to like a really naturally oily whiskey. This has that a little bit. It's not super bad, but again, if it's lower than 43, I would start to get concerned. But generally speaking, I haven't had an issue with this, particularly when you start talking about price. So here in the US, generally, this is going to be about $55 plus tax, give or take, probably a few bucks. I got this more on sale, like an end of the year clearance thing at the end of 2024 for like $40, $45, somewhere in there. But yeah, this is going to tend to be around 55 bucks plus tax, give or take, depending on where you live. In the UK, official Laphroaig site had this at 43 pounds. That includes VAT or tax. It does look like at some of the larger online retailers, this might be closer to like 40 pounds, but obvious. So it's a little bit cheaper in the UK, but you're also getting less alcohol per bottle. So at $55, even that is cheaper than a lot of the 46%ers, Ardbeg 10 and so on and so forth that I've continually mentioned in this video. Those tend to be 60, 65 plus tax. So this is a little bit cheaper, and you're probably more likely to find this one on sale. Supermarkets will be more likely to be running maybe a special on this or something, and maybe getting it closer to that $45 mark might not be all that unusual. But generally speaking, I've been pleasantly surprised. Now, the part of that is just my expectations were pretty low. I have had Laphroaig 10 before. In fact, I think it was one of the bottles that I bought kind of in my initial whiskey geekdom shopping trip. Like, first sticks out in my mind quite a bit when I was first starting to get into whiskey, and I had a limit, or I had made a list of things that I was potentially going to go get. And my first whiskey hunting trip, essentially, I think Laphroaig 10 was one of those bottles. And I haven't had one since then outside of like the cask strength, which I mentioned earlier. But generally speaking, I think this is a perfectly fine whiskey. At 43%, I think if I went to someone's house and they're like, oh, you like whiskey? I've got a bottle of Laphroaig 10. Do you want a glass? I'd be happy to drink a glass of it. I'm certainly not, this isn't going to become a staple on my shelf. But in terms of a score, I think this is a perfect example of like a 5 out of 10 average whiskey for me. If you're a beginner, this is going to be a bold whiskey. This is going to be something that's going to let you know whether you're interested in peat right off the bat or not, or other Islay whiskeys, because this will be more on the intense side. You may be better off if you're really nervous about it. You can start out with like a Johnny Walker Black or something like that, a blended scotch that's going to have that peat smoky quality toned down a bit. But I generally recommend for people just to go for it, because either you're going to like it or you're not going to like it. And in my experience, kind of that diluted peat quality with like diluted with like grain whiskey and that sort of thing, where it's not a single malt. I don't like that style of peat. It makes it like more bitter and kind of acrid, and I'd rather just have the full experience. But that's me. That's what I recommend to beginners. I've had pretty good luck with that, where either they love it or they hate it. And if they hate it, they were going to hate the Johnny Walker anyways. So yeah, this is not a terrible place to start if you're looking for just to find out right away. And if you don't like it yet, good thing about whiskey is you can stick it in the back of your cabinet, forget about it for a while, years, even if you don't have the glass or the bottle too empty, and come back to it maybe when your palate's a little bit more suited for a whiskey that's going to be as flavorful as this one is for a beginner. But for an experienced whiskey drinker, yeah, it's fine. This is the epitome of a 5 out of 10. It's good. I don't think I have any major complaints. I really wish they'd leave the coloring out of it. Obviously, you know they're going to filter it at 43%, but just leave the coloring out of it. I think the flavor would be better if it didn't have that artificial layer of kind of, it's like that toffee note I was talking about. It doesn't really belong there. It makes it taste a little burnt. And I think it would taste just cleaner and more natural if it didn't have the amount of coloring in it that it has. But 5 out of 10. In terms of value, yeah, it's at $55. For me, it's not a great value. I think at $55, there's some blended malts, like from like Compass Box and that sort of thing for $55. There's like McLean's Nose, which is a different style of peat. It's a blended scotch from Adelphi. It's got a lot of Ardnamurchan in it. Even that's like $35-40 here in the US. I'd buy that 10 times over before I bought another bottle of this. But again, those are going to be a little bit different. They're more complex, more mineralic, higher ABV. So those might not be great for a beginner either, but that's what I would go for if I was looking for a peated kind of budget style whiskey. But so value is okay here in the US. You can't ask for too much more. It is going to be one of the cheaper 10-year-old single malt Islay scotches that you can get, and at least we're getting it at that 43% ABV. But yeah, I think that's going to do it for me. Trying to keep it brief and to the point. We'll see how it turns out in post. But yeah, thank you again for joining me. Let me know couple things. Do you still keep a bottle of Laphroaig 10 on your shelf? Are you able to let us know, like, if you've tried the 40 and 43% edition of Laphroaig 10? Is that something that you've done contemporarily, where you can say, like, yes, the 43% version is noticeably better, or would you say that they're pretty comparable overall? Or maybe it's even vice versa. Like I said, I haven't heard great things about the 40% edition. Let me know if I'm wrong on that, or if you believe that I'm wrong on that, but I wouldn't know. I haven't tasted it, at least not in a long, long time. But until next week, thank you for joining me here on Whiskey Uncorked. We'll have another whiskey review ready for you. We'll see if it's another low ABV one. I've got a couple other things that maybe I might break things up with for next week. We'll see how it goes. But until then, cheers.